I'm Christina Cauterucci, and this season on Slow Burn.
It's called Proposition 6.
The Briggs Initiative.
John Briggs is going to fire every gay and lesbian school teacher in California.
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We can't let this happen in California.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Out now, wherever you listen.
My son's birth nearly 10 years ago marked a major turning point in my life. For most of my young adult life, I was something of a hustler, a striver, a seeker of the next gold star. Competence, you could say, was my love language. And look, that orientation to life didn't exactly disappear when I became a solo mom. But what you discover pretty quickly once a baby arrives is that no matter how competent you are, it quickly becomes too much to handle all by yourself. That illusion of control is pretty much thrown out the window, especially if that baby, from time to time, won't sleep, won't eat, cries all night, gets pink eye, takes a tumble at the playground. And it's not just an accident or illness that can turn your world upside down. Suddenly, a work meeting that runs long or a delayed subway ride becomes a near disaster. I spent years feeling as though I was living a life with virtually no margin for error, which isn't particularly fun or sustainable. What's gotten me through it all has been this big web of people. The people who have just shown up for us in the most amazing and mundane ways, who cared for my son when I was too sick to move, who come over for wine, to laugh and vent and commiserate, who love my son in the most amazing and unique ways that defy traditional labels. My son calls them his honorary aunties and uncles. The labels might not matter, but the people do. And I know that they would, no matter what my family looked like, whether I was a single mom or a married one. And so, as we bring this season to a close, I wanted to talk about what we don't talk about when we talk only about marriage. I'm Julie Kohler, and this is White Picket Fence. By now, we know all too well the case that a bunch of pundits and politicians are making for marriage. Or, more accurately, for more ubiquitous marriage. They may talk about increasing happiness, reducing loneliness, alleviating poverty and inequality, but what they're really doing is selling an ideal, a fantasy, the American dream. For an entire season, we've picked apart why that ideal isn't the catch-all solution. But what if there's more to this story? What if prioritizing marriage as the preeminent relationship in our lives actually hurts us? By making it that much harder to form other types of families and prioritize other relationships, even though those more expansive definitions of family can lead to better outcomes for adults, for kids, and for communities.
The closer that my household got to that ideal, the harder it was for us to keep our shit together.
That's Mia Birdsong, the author of How We Show Up, Reclaiming Family, Friendship, and Community. Mia was raised by a single mom, with support from aunts and other members of her community. But as an adult, she found herself living in a traditional nuclear family. Husband, kids, good jobs.
And while both my husband and I grew up in families where chosen family and community played a really significant role, we felt like we were just kind of drifting into this American dream ideal. And I just had a lot of questions about that.
The longer Mia lived the American dream, the more she felt isolated by it. She spent every day between her house and her office. Her entire life orbited around her work, her family. There wasn't time for anything else. Or anyone else.
People who achieve this American dream, make more money, find a partner, have kids, whatever, also become more isolated, become more disconnected. They have fewer friends, and when they do have friends, like they see those people less, or the quality of those friendships, those relationships outside of their home relationship become thinner.
Mia realized that isolation is engineered. To have it all in American society is to gather the essentials of what Mia calls the hierarchy of relationships, the people we're conditioned to invest our time and energy into, our spouses, our children, our jobs, and then, if we've got time left over, maybe our friendships. When Mia was researching her book, she intentionally set out to flip that hierarchy on its head. She spoke to people who were actively engaged in their communities, who relied on others for support, like I do. Many of these networks of care, as Mia calls them, are often excluded from view, not how we picture the American dream.
There are communities of people who have always done this. Queer folks, for sure. Black folks, for sure. People who are less resourced, so poor people, unhoused people. Because this is who we are, right? To be human is to require community and relationship.
Folks whose families don't fit one specific structure are often left to their own devices. And yet, where systems fail, communities can actually thrive.
And I found that in many instances, the solutions that we are looking for as a society exist already in communities who don't hold power, don't have as much privilege, are not in charge of things.
To live a life in community is to rely on others for all kinds of things: childcare, economic support, emotional support, and to provide for others too. No one person is supposed to fill every role. They can't. But if we model our lives after the nuclear family, we focus on getting all that support from within our own home.
It tethers happiness to this very specific idea of success. And that success is about accumulation, the acquisition of things, land, a spouse, children, and it leaves very little time to tend to yourself or to other relationships. And our society, both culturally and structurally, does not support our ability to have and maintain deep, meaningful relationships outside of our household.
For most of this season, we've been talking about marriage as the way to solve the loneliness crisis. Turns out, it might be contributing to it by making us more isolated.
And so the narrative is we need to be promoting and encouraging marriage and in particular adherence to this nuclear family ideal in order to provide that sense of connection.
Ugh, yes.
Why is that so faulty? Why is that rationale and that logic so faulty?
It makes me want to throw up.
I mean, think about it. In what other context do we tell people to place all their bets on one person?
Like, just for probability reasons, that's a stupid thing to do. My husband is amazing. I love the shit out of that man. And he cannot provide me with everything that I need. Like, he just can't. And my other relationships are so fundamental to my joy, to my ability to stay hopeful, to my development and growth as a human being, and frankly, to my marriage.
We're told by conservatives that marriage is the natural way to be, that anything other than marriage is what's odd or deficient. But that's not really the case.
I also think about what it is meant for my children to have community and to have adults besides my husband and I to help raise them. 2 people is not enough to raise children. And the people who I've learned that the most from are single moms.
And yet, nothing about the way that we have structured modern family life facilitates community building.
Everything that is inside of us is longing for and trying to move toward each other. It's like we are plants that are meant to be growing in the rainforest. All of the potential is inside of us. We are meant for a life of connection, and we have been planted in a giant, concrete slab. And there's no rain, right? It is not us, because it requires additional energy and effort and time, which so many of us don't have.
So how did we end up here? If we know friendships and community make our lives richer, why aren't they valued more? It turns out they used to be.
Friendship was just so much more important and a key to a good life in the past than it's understood to be today, where I think it really, for a lot of people, friendship is a nice to have and not a need to have.
That's Raina Cohen, author of The Other Significant Others. Her research for her book led her down a historical rabbit hole about friendship.
What I ended up seeing was that we are the odd ones right now in the broad sweep of history, and that friendship is really whittled down to something that is much less important than it has been in the past. And that's in stark contrast to the way that what you would read from ancient Romans and Greek philosophers who would talk about friendship as the most important part of a good life, or would talk about friends in the language that we would use for spouses now, like the other half of my soul.
Raina points to 2 main transformations in the way we think about relationships. The first is that, about 150 years ago, hegemonic heterosexual culture became suspicious of intimate same-sex friendships, the kinds of friendships we often develop when we're children. The second, which we've discussed in previous episodes, is that marriage went from being a really pragmatic economic relationship to the main organizing structure of our lives. By giving marriage this exalted status, friendship becomes an afterthought. It's devalued. But what about when friendship really is central to a person's life and provides many of the emotional benefits that we associate with marriage? Folks in that situation often find themselves in a no man's land. Raina told me about one such couple she came across while working on the book, Barb and Inez. 50 years ago, they met in a small town.
Both of their lives were taking a bit of a turn that they hadn't expected.
Barb had just returned home to take care of her parents' finances. Inez had just separated from her husband and lived with her kids in a house in the suburbs.
I don't know if it had a white picket fence, but very, very likely did.
They ended up working in the same office. They got on really well. And Barb loved Inez's kids. She didn't have any of her own.
One of their early memories together was taking a 2-week trip to Washington, D.C. with Barb, Inez, and the kids. They really felt like they'd operated as a family. And moving forward in life, they really look like a family.
Later, Barb moved back to Phoenix, and Inez followed with her kids. She ended up buying a house around the corner. Barb helped out with childcare. Fast forward, they're on the cusp of retirement and decide to move again. They want to live next to each other, but can't afford it.
So bought a house together, which is where I met them. And they had been living in that house for about 25 years at that point. When I look at their friendship, what I see is partnership, really. There's not a lot of daylight between what they have and I think what spouses have, though, that's not the language they use. They see what they have as friendship. And it's enabled them to be able to live both independently, like as a non-institution, and also with a lot of support and, social sustenance in their lives.
But one day, Inez had to go to the hospital. An ambulance came to the house, and the nurse told Barb, who'd taken care of Inez for years, that she shouldn't even bother trying to go to the hospital. She wouldn't be let in.
And indeed, when she gets to the hospital, she's asked by a nurse, "Are you family?" And Barb says, "No, a friend." And she's told to wait in the car. It's the winter, so she's literally waiting out in the cold in Missouri while Inez is in the ER.
Usually it's the spouse who has medical power of attorney. And that's who's allowed to be involved in medical decisions like these.
A half hour later, Barb goes back up to the nurse. The nurse asks, "Do you know who has Inez's medical power of attorney?" And Barb says, "I do." So she is then let into the hospital. What's really interesting there is that Inez and Barb have created legal protections for each other. They have medical and legal power of attorney rights for one another. But when the rubber hit the road, that paper did not confer a status that was recognizable, at least not immediately.
In about 40 states, your only option, if you want a legal partnership, is marriage. Our institutions privilege marriage over any other kind of relationship, no matter who is the most important person in your everyday life. Barb and Inez felt like they were a family, and in many ways they were. They cared for one another, raised kids together, lived together. But the fact that they aren't married created real problems for them. And they had few options to address the gap between their experience as a family and society's perception of them.
There is this feedback loop where the law is telling us which relationships matter and saying that friendship doesn't. It is not a relationship that you can recognize in any clear way, other than the piecemeal way that Barb and Inez did, but then you don't get the status. And we kind of have the prevailing idea that friendship isn't that important, so there's not a lot of rush to change the law.
It's not so simple to try and categorize a relationship that is different from a marriage as a marriage for the sake of legal protections. It's like trying to stick a square peg in a round hole. Legal alternatives to marriage do exist, like domestic partnerships. In Colorado, there's something called the Designated Beneficiary Agreement, which allows people to pick and choose who they want to benefit from 16 selected financial and health rights, like healthcare and estate planning. But that's 16 of the over 1,000 rights and benefits packaged into marriage. It also requires that people seek these legal solutions out before they need them. And in the heat of the moment, a medical emergency, a death, they need to know how to exercise those rights, how to make it clear they're important when they're not a spouse, but someone else.
The theorist Gail Rubin once coined the term the charm circle. And by that, what she meant was that there's a charm circle of which identities and relationships and sexualities are considered acceptable.
That's Mary Bernstein, a professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut. Mary is talking about this pool of identities we as a society have deemed respectable enough to gain acceptance, sometimes in the form of legal protections. In 2015, that circle inched outwards a bit with the Obergefell ruling. As a reminder, this ruling legalized same-sex marriage. Obergefell didn't just codify same-sex marriage. It also exposed the holes in the legal structure that many same-sex couples were using in place of marriage. Marriage equality made a lot of extremely common legal situations a lot easier for couples to navigate.
Even things like if a partner dies, if you are legally married, then it's the surviving spouse who gets to decide what happens to the body of, your deceased spouse, your deceased loved ones. Otherwise, the family might come in. They might be homophobic. They might go against the wishes of the deceased. And so marriage as a legal contract is incredibly powerful.
But is that enough? Rather than piecemeal attempting to expand the charm circle, shouldn't we be trying to blow it up altogether? On that point, Mary's pragmatic.
I think that there will always be regulation. I think the question is not regulation versus no regulation. The question is, what are the better ways of regulating that we can do? How can we support more people, more families? How can we do it in a way that doesn't rely on marriage?
It's not only close friends like Barb and Inez who get left out of our marriage-focused policies. Mary shared a story about a group of people living together in Hartford, Connecticut, who defied the norms of a nuclear family. The laws in place made it nearly impossible for them to live as they wanted to. This group of people decided to buy an old mansion on a wealthy tree-lined street named Scarborough.
People aren't buying these big mansions on Scarborough anymore because people don't usually have 8 children. So a group of people, 11 people, 3 married couples, a couple of single people, and the married couples had children, and it added up to 11 people. The media called them the Scarborough 11. They pooled their resources, and they were artists, theater directors, teachers, social justice activists, and they wanted to live collectively.
Their living arrangement worked for them just fine. But before long, it clashed with their neighbors. Other people on this very wealthy street started noticing how many cars were parked out front.
And so they figured out that, oh, wait a minute, this is a non-traditional group of people living here. And they called the city, and having money and wealth, they were able to be heard. And they were accused of violating the zoning laws in the city of Hartford because they did not meet the traditional definition of family.
Specifically, Hartford zoning codes allow an unlimited number of people related by blood, marriage, civil union, or adoption to cohabitate. But only 2 unrelated people can legally live together in a single-family home. This left the Scarborough 11, 8 adults and 3 children, outside the definition of family. They were a functional family, but they weren't a formal one, at least in the legal sense. And that was a problem. As of this recording, the Scarborough 11 are still in that house at a legal standstill with the city of Hartford. They're asking that zoning laws be changed to let them continue living there. It's not their household that necessarily caused a problem. It's the fact that the systems weren't designed for them. And it's not just the Scarborough 11.
I mean, there are other ways in which people have been working to live together. You know, co-housing has been a big movement. There are other ways in which people are working to create alternative kinds of arrangements to the kind of heteronormative nuclear family. We may not recognize it as such. I'm not sure when people think about co-housing that they necessarily think about that as a family movement. But I would argue, why not? If it's people who are, who are choosing to live together, whatever form that might take, that might actually serve the functions of a family, right? Emotional caretaking, social caretaking, maybe mingling of finances.
All of these things, how we build housing, how we zone for housing, are based on the assumption of the nuclear family. And culturally, all of the messages that we receive to this day create the expectation that coupling off, having kids, buying your own house are the goals, the outward signs of success. It can be hard to chart your own course, even when you want to. Raina has firsthand knowledge of that.
I have gotten caught on this sort of conveyor belt myself where I'm like, well, what's the next thing you're supposed to do?
Raina's talking about the hesitation she felt when she and her husband first considered moving in with their friends, a married couple with children.
I was like, I don't know that we should, rent with these friends. Does it make sense financially? And he was like, well, what are our values? And I had to be like, oh yeah, duh. I'm like literally writing a book about friendship. What matters to me? Friendship, especially these friends.
What are your values? It's like asking, what makes you happy? And for a lot of people, the answer isn't just marriage.
And I think it's so easy to not identify the value, just do what you're told, and only pay attention to the attainment of the ideal, which is to be an adult who has, a nice home with, mid-century modern furniture, whatever the trappings are of success, and not think about all that you have lost, the isolation, the disconnection, the absence of support.
When Raina and her husband moved in with their friends and their kids, their community got bigger. All of the values Raina knew she wanted to invest in grew. And so did the questions she had about the limitations of nuclear families.
I know that you're looking into the discourse around marriage now, and a big piece of it is two parents are better than one. And, my question to that is, why two? Why have we arrived at two adults as the ideal and maximum number of supportive figures in a child's life? So in my case, I am not a co-parent to my friend's children. I live with two of my friends, their two kids, and my husband. But just being around is helpful. My friends both have to travel in a few weeks for work, and my husband and I can do the morning routine for them and be trusted figures in the kids' lives. And they just have these other adults that they enjoy being around.
And it's not just good for the kids.
And as friends, I know my friends in an entirely different way because I see them as parents, which is not a mode that you often get to see people in, other than maybe in snippets. It's just sort of a rewarding setup for everybody involved, and really points to how so many people could benefit from a less isolated setup than we have taken, not just as the norm, but as the ideal. That the ideal is that you are going to have your beautiful home with a lawn and a backyard and maybe the fence surrounding it, and not thinking about all that we give up for that isolation and that we could gain by maybe trading off some privacy against the connection and the support.
Marriage itself is not the problem. The problem is our reliance on marriage as the only path, the only solution. The fact that we don't have legal resources for people who want to build relationships, family, and community instead of, or in addition to, being married.
I would encourage people to think about all of the roles that are bundled within a marriage, and then write those out and think about who in your life you would actually like to have in those roles. Who would you like making medical decisions for you? Who do you want to be going to the grocery store with? I think we should be trying to imagine safety nets or webs of support, and not just a single person who can be there. It's a better support system, security system to fall back on. If I'm falling backwards, I would rather have a bunch of people with interlocked hands trying to catch me rather than just one person. What I saw in the people who have these extraordinarily close friendships is that there's plenty of room to have both a great romantic relationship and a friendship that is at the same level of partnership.
Raina is married, so is Mia. And, as they've pointed out, it's having the choice, the freedom, to create family in your own way that's most beneficial. And that doesn't have to come at the expense of marriage. It can make marriage stronger.
In fact, what I found when I talked to these people is that a really strong friendship and a strong romantic relationship makes each relationship better, that the romantic relationship ends up having less of a load.
Marriage isn't all or nothing, and that's the beauty of it. Rather than try and squeeze everything under the umbrella of marriage, what if we anchored our lives around a greater number of unique and equally important relationships? It won't be easy. If we want to live in a society that supports interdependence, we need to have a radical reconceptualization of what it means to center relationships, different types of relationships, a multitude of them.
For so many people, what they want is knowing that there is somebody who cares about the intricacies of their life, who also knows them really intimately and in a vulnerable way, and makes them feel like they're not moving through the world alone. And that's what these friendships give to people, which I think is, if you want to have a partner in life, that's kind of one of the best things that somebody can provide to you.
Talking to Mia, Mary, and Raina left me feeling hopeful. Like I wasn't alone in craving a more expansive community. It was invigorating to hear from people who are identifying ways to make life a little less isolated. At the same time, I'm worried that the current marriage panic may make moving in that direction even harder. That instead of thinking creatively about what we as a society could do to create a greater sense of belonging, we'll be barraged with messages and policies designed to do just one thing: get people married. And what concerns me most about that is that at first blush, the whole debate can seem kind of innocuous. Even if the marriage promoters seem silly and retro, are they really dangerous? At a moment when we're facing a lot of big threats to our freedoms, to our democracy, are a few guys popping off about marriage really something to be concerned about? The whole purpose of this podcast, over 5 seasons now, is to uncover what's hidden in plain view, to bring things to the surface, and raise awareness of the more subtle ways that inequity and injustice are perpetuated. The current marriage panic is just that. It is, at its core, a panic over the fact that women's expectations for marriage have changed, and that those expectations, coupled with a set of legal reforms, have transformed the institution, making it more fair, inclusive, egalitarian, and fulfilling. It's a panic over the prospect of new economic policies that would guarantee fundamental rights and benefits to all people, not just those deemed deserving. It is a panic that one particular way of life may not be so special after all. The current marriage panic isn't really even about marriage. It's about control. And the best way to combat it is to honor freedom of choice and trust that each of us knows what's best for our own lives. What can that look like? Taking a deep breath and stepping off the cultural conveyor belt. Being intentional about how we want to live, who we want to spend time with, show up for. It means standing up to politicians who evoke family in ways that are hurtful and exclusionary. We can't individually change the fabric of our society, but each of us can start to pull the threads tighter, to realize that we're all woven together in community, in marriage, friendship, parenthood, in all the myriad ways that we build families. That's it for this season of White Picket Fence. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, I've got a little favor to ask. If you're enjoying this season, please leave us a rating and a review. Tell your friends to subscribe. We always want to build a bigger community of listeners, and you can help. White Picket Fence is a Wonder Media Network production. Our producers are Maddie Foley, Carmen Borca Carrillo, Abby Delk, and Lauren Williams. Our editor is Lindsay Cradawell. Executive producer is Jenny Kaplan. Original music by Sean Patel. Special thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Shared Ascent Fund for their generous support for this season.
Hey there, I'm Lark.
I'm Jessica.
And I'm Hillary. We're the hosts of Hearsay, a new podcast series from the National Women's Law Center.
In each episode, we deep dive into the cultural moments that live rent-free in our heads. From exploring workers' rights through reality TV to walking down memory lane revisiting the many flawed media depictions of abortion.
Because we work at NWLC, we have access to the experts who can help us connect the dots between the issues that we work on and those pop culture moments that you just can't stop thinking about.
Join us each episode as we debrief on the latest happenings in our corners of the internet and explore what they mean for society as a whole.
Subscribe now to Hearsay wherever you get your podcasts, and let's dive deep into the moments that define us.